Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today for this session in the series of webinars that are part of Different Memories, Shared Futures towards Inclusive Memorialization in the Western Balkans project. Today, I am delighted to be able to host two of my friends, Frauke de Veer and Alison Castell, who are authors of a seminal paper, I think, on the issue that we will be discussing, which is how collective trauma shapes narratives, memory, and identity, and what it means, what this means for those working on inclusive memorialization. The paper titled Fractured Stories, Fragmented Societies, Addressing Collective Trauma Through Narrative Engagement, was published by the Institute for Integrated Transitions. Frauke, Alison, and I are members of the Inclusive Narratives Practice Group that is hosted by this institute. And this paper in particular explores the relationship between collective trauma and narrative in post-conflict and divided societies. I already sent the biographies of Frauke and Alison, but for those who will be watching the recording of this, I will just briefly introduce them. Frauke holds degrees from the University of Utrecht and Harvard University. She's an independent professional in the field of conflict prevention, peace building, and inclusive governance with extensive experience in different parts of the world, including Kenya and Afghanistan. She's a policy advisor, and in recent years, she has increasingly specialized in identity, collective trauma, and narrative. And Dr. Alison Castell, she is an associate professor of rhetoric and communication studies at Regis University. Her research and teaching centers on critical approaches to conflict narrative and dialogue, and her recent work examines narrative engagement across difference, including how different narrative strategies can either reinforce or reduce adversarial dynamics. Alison and Frauke, welcome, and thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great to be here.
And well, the format of this conversation is that in the first 45 minutes, I will interview you on three key areas. We'll try to frame collective trauma and narrative, what this means, what the collective trauma means in the context of narratives in conflict societies. We'll talk about memory, identity, and victimhood, and try to also discuss some positive practices when it comes to memorialization in this context. So then we will open the discussion to all of our participants. Please raise your hand and then I will unmute you so that you can ask the question, or you can post your question in the chat. So without any delay, let me turn to you, Frauke, and let's start with some definitions, and especially the most important one. Your paper talks about the idea that trauma is not just individual, but collective and socially transmitted. Can you tell us what is collective trauma and how do we think of trauma at the level of society, not simply individuals?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Rafik, and it's wonderful to be here. And I'm very much aware that most of the people that are listening to this webinar are practitioners, are actually working in this field, so all extremely knowledgeable. So it's really an honor to be here with you. And I hope that some of these concepts and the way that we have learned and started to think about this may be helpful to you, sometimes a new way of looking at issues you're already very familiar with, or finding a new framing can be helpful. So I hope that some of this may be helpful. to you. So yeah, so what do we mean by the term collective trauma? Well, it refers to the psychological and social reactions to traumatic events that affect a large group of people or an entire society. So it's a little different from a large number of people with individual trauma. It's really how it affects the social group, how it affects the society, and how it changes the narratives, the culture, the sort of psyche of a group. So with collective trauma, the traumatic stresses are experienced as a group, as a social group. So it's then experienced collectively through shared emotions like fear, loss, victimhood, and it becomes embedded, comes imprinted into the DNA of the culture, institutions, and everyday practices. So in a way, it's similar or it's linked to individual trauma. Because what we know about individuals who undergo trauma is that their sense of self is disrupted. So the way that they relate to the world, they relate to others, they relate to the social group that they're part of, how they relate to the world at large, it's disrupted. It's like the ground underneath your feet is fallen to pieces. So something similar happens actually at group level, at societal level. There's also this similar disruption of their understanding of how they, as a group, relate to the world and how they relate to others. So the sense of identity, the sense of belonging, it takes a hit, and it erodes a sense of psychological safety, of identity, security, if you like. And that therefore then creates a psychological need to recreate that understanding, to recreate that psychological ground underneath one's feet. And that is done by creating new narratives, new stories, a new orienting moral order, if you like. And that's how it then gets imprinted into culture, institutions, ways of being. And I think another important element of collective trauma is that it does get transcended. So these stories become imprinted, and therefore not every single individual needs to actually have undergone or lived through these traumatic events. And it may even feel to individuals that they have felt it, they have gone through it, but it's actually passed on as a collective memory, and they feel that it's part of them.
Let me just ask you a very quick follow-up question. When you talk about this, can this be a mechanism, a survival mechanism, in the sense of a group that is under threat, let's say, in conflict or repression, genocide, trying to make sense of how to come around the story to survive?
Absolutely. And that's actually what makes this so difficult and maybe not always very well understood, because it is such a strong psychological need. It is really a coping mechanism that is of the absolute essence. So the similar way that individuals that have undergone trauma is to establish reestablish this sense of self, of actually being able to create a new story for themselves, absolutely essential to healing. So something similar happens at group level. So it's a very, very deep psychological need that is happening to a large extent subconsciously, but it is a coping mechanism. But over time, it can become very maladaptive. But dislodging it is therefore really, really dangerous for people, because it is a renewed ground underneath their feet, which they really don't want to see disrupted again. So that's what makes it so tenacious in a way.
We will get to that. And I just want to say this is of particular relevance for what we are trying to do in this project, because the whole idea of the inclusive memorialization, in a way, is about complexifying very ossified, very simplistic, if you want, narratives that have everything to do with collective trauma. And sometimes we see ferocious reactions to attempts at complexification that have to do with this. This is why I really wanted us to talk about this in this webinar series. So let me turn to you, Alison, and ask you, well, in your work and in this paper, you describe narratives as systems that give meaning and coherence to experience. This is another very important definition. Can you elaborate on this? What happens to these systems, if you want? First of all, explain to us what are these systems, and then what happens to them when a society undergoes such massive violence, let's say, or repression.
Thank you for the question. And I just want to thank everybody for being here and echo Frauke's remarks about knowing that there's a great amount of expertise in this room, and can only hope that this is a generative conversation that we can have. And when we talk about narrative systems, what I want to try to move the thinking away from is that we just have like individual stories and everybody tells a story, and there's a huge impulse to just storytelling. But recognizing narratives as systems recognizes that these stories actually do work in the world, right? They have constructs, they make certain things, meanings possible, certain actions possible. And in turn, they also make certain, by the positioning of how people are positioned within narratives, it makes some people legitimate, some people not legitimate, some stories legitimate, some stories not legitimate, as we're going to talk about. And it can actually, when the stories ossify the way that you're talking about, and even if just they become dominant and not, so rigid, it can make it seem like it's the only way to make sense of things. It can make it seem like the only story that's out there, the only narrative that's out there. And the narratives are how the events get linked together. It's how people get framed or positioned as responsible or innocent or victim. And therefore what kinds of emotions are appropriate. And it really does have serious implications. The way that those narratives are organized has serious implications for practice. What are the responses? What are the responses institutionally? What are the responses in your communities? Things like that. So in that sense, the narratives aren't just reflecting reality, they're actively shaping how people come to understand and act within a particular reality. And that's a really important shift, right? That they're not just representations, they're actually co-creating or creating the ways in which we can behave through the meaning that we're making. And so, when a society goes in, has mass trauma, mass violence, stories are, the people's way of making sense of the world is shattered, as we've talked about, and the narratives reorganize. And the patterns that we see, the most consistent patterns, is that narratives reorganize in really simplified ways. So in narrative language, that means they're linear. The plots are linear. The morality is super clear. So that's where we get like, I'm innocent, they're, I'm pure, they're evil, things like that. And a level of certainty about, and I think you already touched on this, little certainty of like what the truth is and what actually happened starts to really, really consolidate. And this is, it's understandable. People are trying to make sense of something that is completely overwhelming, that has shattered their lives. And so, you want to cling to something that makes sense. And so the first order of sense making is this kind of oversimplified sense making, because the narrative doesn't want to open up to complexity, because complexity can be ambiguous, complexity can be unsure. And so there's a level within which you're talking about that like protective mechanism of the simplified narratives can operate as protective mechanisms, even though we're not consciously doing that, so that's essentially what, and so that happens even at the cost of not having, peaceful relations.
Can you just, again, I know that we have all these questions to get through, and hopefully we'll be able to do it in the next 5 hours. That much I have set aside for this webinar. But what really interests me for you to explain is how real or perceived violence impacts these narratives. Because in the sense, let me give you the example, our example. My generation at least, we grew up in the former Yugoslavia, which had a very strong ideology of brotherhood and unity when applied to ethnic relations, let's say, or the makeup of the. Basically, the story was that we had one common enemy, and that was like the class enemy that was exploiting all of us together. So we were brothers, in fact, and that difference, historical or ethnic, was not as important as our unity in trying to live a free and dignified life. That got shattered into all these different narratives that got divided, let's say, in the 90s through violence, basically. Violence shattered these narratives in various different individual narratives. But even before then, violence of the past, going back hundreds of years, was invoked to reconstitute different narratives of different groups. So talking about, each group, the intellectuals and the politicians leading this new kind of division that was emerging, were reaching back as far as they needed to find a traumatic event to say, see, this is what really happened to us. This is the real truth, and we should come around this truth. So I want you to maybe illuminate a little bit for us the power of this kind of violence, real and imagined, in this kind of shattering of narrative systems that can seem immovable, that can seem set in stone in a way.
It's a really big question. And part of what I'm thinking about is just that these patterns, just to say, aren't only in times of mass violence. The way that a narrative gets simplified can happen when you have a domestic partner fight or a fight with your friend. So that's how quickly the simplified narratives can emerge, right? So you have it happening at a societal level, but it doesn't mean that you need catastrophic events in order for narratives to simplify. So I want to just, put that out there so that it doesn't seem like it's this phenomenon that's only happening in these extreme cases, because it's not. The other thing is that in order for narratives in order to understand, so what ends up happening is a simplified narrative is a very coherent narrative. It organizes so tightly around itself that it's hard to poke a hole in it, right? And when you have like a really coherent narrative, that's when you want to say like, something's up. We have to take a look at that. So while we, in terms of when we're experiencing violence, we develop a coherent narrative, that's actually can backfire. And so I'm not sure if the example that you're giving is that these coherent narratives that once were able to bring people together ended up not being able to hold the actual complexity of what the reality was that was going on. And so they eventually had to break open. And I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're naming, but that is what happens, is that if a narrative becomes so coherent, it's leaving things out. It's leaving stories out, it's leaving experiences out, it's leaving people out. And if it does that, it can only hold for so long. Now, the other part of what builds coherence or what makes people anchor onto narratives are their histories, mythic pasts, ways in which value systems emerged historically over time, the stories that get repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, that actually, end up consolidated in our thought patterns and our, you know, in our ways of making sense of our countries and the ways of making sense of our families, you know. And so with that repetition, it starts to build out that coherence. And, you know, just because we don't necessarily, and I think this is a point that you were pulling out, is just because we don't think it's the truth, it doesn't mean that the people who are most likely to speak a certain narrative or embedded within it don't feel its coherence. Because that's what we do, right? We make
Absolutely.
sure that we have coherence. So whether you think I'm telling the truth or not, I have a coherence going on that I'm embodying, you know, and that is going to, you know, kind of determine in many ways, I don't want to make it so deterministic, but is going to influence and create certain pathways where I can behave in certain ways and not in other ways.
Again, I
Add on, could I add
convinced.
on to this a little
I
bit?
want to ask you, Frauke, the next question, which is directly just coming out of this, and that has to do with you talk about your paper about collective trauma being encoded in the identity, in the culture, and this is where what we touched upon, and especially for us working in the memorialization field, the memory field, I think this is one of the crucial elements of this encoding. And I want to hear from you, what do you mean? What did you find? How does this encoding happen? And what is very important to me, and again, going back to the example of Western Balkans and what Alison just touched upon, it doesn't have to be true. It doesn't have to be historically factual to become the vehicle for collective trauma to be encoded in a group's identity and culture in this way. Please.
Yeah. No, I think the what you mentioned before, Rafik, and the way you were describing what happened in the Western Balkans, I think what happens in a situation like that is there is violence, there is traumatic events, and it leads to withdrawing inside the in-group, because experiences are shared and are particularly shared by a particular social group that undergoes similar traumatic events. So it's a turning inward and it's a creating of a new narrative within that in-group based on these shared experiences. And it does lead to collective emotions, to collective memories. And as Alison said before, these stories tend to be simplified, linear, leaving out a lot of things, but also very, very clearly apportioning blame. So what is legitimate, what is not legitimate, where is blame placed? And that requires, and I think this is really important in the example you gave, Rafik, that requires a degree of othering. It requires a degree of seeing one's own social identity. And as I said before, it's seeing oneself or one's group in relation to others. We're all relational creatures in relation to other groups, in relation to the larger world. So it requires a degree of othering. And that's why a lot of these stories become very black and white, very good and evil. And in fact, I just read this theory, which I hadn't actually read before, about how sometimes minor differences between social groups, when the language is actually the same, when people look the same, there's actually a deliberate attempt at elevating these differences, making these differences larger in order to enable that othering to take place, because it's very difficult to other someone who's actually very much like you. So, and that brings back to the question you asked before, Rafik. So this is a strong psychological need in a way. So these stories, they become part of one's identity, and they become really strong sort of identity markers. You know, one's identity as a victim, it needs to be sustained. So how does it then get encoded? By repeating, by retelling. And through that retelling, it becomes more calcified, more ossified, and perhaps even more simplified. So it is that repetition, and therefore seeing that as the one way of understanding the world. But this is where it gets now a bit complicated, because to some extent this is a subconscious psychological process, right? But on the other hand, this is something that can very explicitly be used. So the mode of imprinting and the mode of transmission is partially through family stories, through even silencing. Silence in the family is actually a really important mode of transmission, of what gets told, what does not get told, which emotions are allowed, which ones are not allowed. So all that is part of a more sort of subconscious mode of transmission. But then there is, very deliberate attempts by politicians, by bringing, one narrative to the surface, by policing that, making sure that's the one story that gets told, what ends up in education materials, what ends up in curricula, what ends up in the media. So there it's much more explicit, it's much more instrumentalized and weaponized even. So these are two quite distinct modes of transmission, but both of them mean that it gets increasingly part of the cultural DNA and part of one's deeply held identity. And that identity, I think it's important to understand, there's such a need for psychological security. And that identity becomes so strongly linked to that sense of psychological security. So letting go of that identity is psychologically extremely costly.
Let me turn back to Alison for a question that I think, again, I love the way that we are weaving this conversation from one concept to the other. But what Frauke was talking about now does not happen organically. And your paper suggests that societies actively shape what is remembered and what is not. And I want you to elaborate on how is this done. I mean, we in the Western Balkans, but I have to say, even in the world today, we are witnessing this every day in terms of those in power being able to decide which memories are allowed or which memories are central and which are to be erased. How does this happen?
Well, I think that Frauke touched on a lot of it, because this isn't, these are, the argument that we're making is that these remembrances are socially produced, right? And it's not that someone is necessarily sitting behind a desk going, this is how we're going to remember, this is the story that we're going to tell, and but the way that sense making happens and people make sense and try to understand circumstances, as I said before, connect certain events, connect certain ideas, and coherence builds around that. And so it's not just one actor, it's not just produced through formal mechanisms, although it is produced through formal mechanisms. It's also produced relationally. It's produced in your everyday activities and your practices and your interactions with your families, right? And that's what makes the whole memory process so durable. So we do have the idea that it's taught in schools, it's in the media, it's, whatever the stories are that get traction, right? And we know that only certain kinds of stories get traction in the media, right? And we know that certain people are able to determine what the curriculum is in schools. In that case, it's usually whomever has, the power to decide which story is told. And in that way, some things get pushed to the margins. And, I like what you told us, Rafiq. I forget when it was, but that you were talking about how in your own life, you can be hanging out with a friend, talking about anything you want, about sensitive topics and being able to talk about the things that might not necessarily be appropriate if you're in an institutional setting, and that can have a certain element of, we'll call it narrative freedom. And then as soon as a third person comes, you have to be wary about the kinds of stories that you're telling. And in a way, that is instantiating a certain kind of remembering, because in that moment, one part kind of remembering gets cut off, and the other part, then it becomes whatever that space can hold, right? And that space obviously constricts, the narrative space constricts the minute that happens. So over time, I'd say it's like, it's not just that you have a shared memory, right? Or shared memories, but I'm thinking about it in like a memory landscape, right? Where certain things are viable, certain things aren't. This idea of, legitimacy. So who has agency, who doesn't? And once this terrain gets set the way that it does, through all of these different actions, because if you have an institutional narrative that's coming out and it doesn't get instantiated on the ground, then it's not going to hold. It might have power, but it's not necessarily going to hold all of society, right? You get to create spaces where different forms of narratives can exist, just like with you and your friend. But if, depending on how policed that area is, that region is, some stories are going to be easier to access, some are going to be more difficult to access, and that's part of how the system operates.
This is particularly important for us in this conversation, but also for us living in this part of the world. And I want to ask both of you, so please feel free to jump in as you see fit, maybe to address it to Frauke, but Alison, please also contribute. The issue of memorialization. We are living a moment where there is the battle for what is to be remembered is being fought by those in power being able to decide what is going to be symbolically memorialized. So what memorials will be erected, to whom, how will they be used to go against the facts, so to speak, in the sense that, in a way, we all know what happened. If we are talking about a neighborhood here in Priedo, where I'm speaking from, we all know what happened. If we go beyond that, we have ICTY's verdicts, we have an enormous body of evidence about facts about what happened. But this kind of connection between collective trauma, the power to decide what is to be remembered and who is to be remembered, and how this narrative is to shape the reality in which we live, this is the main battle of the moment. And we can see it not only here in Bosnia, we can see it in Croatia, we can see it in Kosovo, we can see it in Montenegro, in Serbia, everywhere, that this is one of the key political issues. Who is going to have the power to shape the way that we remember the past and to legitimize or re-legitimize certain policies and so on? Can you tell us how is this to be recognized in the sense of us being able to tell that this is what is going on, versus allowing our collective trauma to buy into this and to embrace dehumanization of the other, 30 years after the fact, to say, yes, he was not a war criminal, he was a hero. See, he has a monument here, and we will all go and once a year gather around this memorial to reinforce the fact that what they are saying about their suffering is untrue, and that in fact we were the victims and they were the villains.
Well, Rafik, I wish I had an answer for you, which I'm afraid I do not. And as much as I'm not an expert on the Western Balkans at all, I know that the politicization and instrumentalization of narrative is particularly strong in the Western Balkans. So I think you do have, a very complex situation that you're dealing with there. But a few thoughts that come to mind. I think already, and I think we already touched upon this, the difference between memories as sense making versus and its relationship to the truth. So you already mentioned how some events from, way back can be used to legitimize particular stories. So factual accuracy, historical accuracy has very little to do actually with memorialization. And I think that's a very powerful force that is at play as these different stories, they just become used, and that they become used by politicians as well to further delegitimize other perspectives and strengthens one's own narrative. So knowing the truth, I think, is actually not so much part of what's going on. Because it doesn't actually help to shift narratives. But also when I hear you say that, I think that when you say we all know what the truth is, I think that everyone or every member of a particular social group still has its own story of what happened, right? So there's still all these different narratives that are at play together. And that is what is also being used by these politicians or by those people that are trying to instrumentalize and weaponize these stories. So maybe I'm being too hopeful here, but what we are hoping is that by becoming more aware is how we all as individuals are being influenced by these stories, how they simplify the reality, how they leave out things, how they're not bringing in nuance, not bringing in complexity. The more we become aware of, in a way, how we've become prisoners of that particular story, of that particular narrative. Some people have called them memory prisons. I think that's a very accurate term. Perhaps
Do illuminate that concept, please.
Yeah, so it has to do with this what we spoke about, how this particular narrative or this particular identity or this particular way of sense making becomes passed on, and becomes part of our DNA. That means that we are looking at the world in a somewhat constrained matter, because we're looking at the world through the lens of this overly simplified, dualistic narrative. So it leaves out the complexity, it leaves out nuance, it leaves out different ways of perceiving the world. It also leaves out action options or pathways, as Alison likes to speak about it, and that keeps us constrained, and it keeps us in the prison, actually, because the memory shapes what we can or cannot do, what we can or cannot feel, what we're allowed to feel or not allowed to feel, and there's a real reduction of agency and of freedom in there. And our hope is a little bit, as soon as people become more aware of the fact that it is actually placing boundaries, it is actually keeping people captured and imprisoned, that there is more of a desire to escape out of that prison. So before we were speaking about the psychological cost of doing so, but there's also a psychological cost of being kept inside a prison. So hopefully by sort of seeing both sides of that there is more openness, perhaps, to complexify one's own narrative. I'm not even yet speaking about understanding the other narrative, because that may still be a bridge too far, but at least sort of complexifying and seeing more nuance in one's own narrative can help. And again, what maybe my overly optimistic hope is that would make people a little less likely to go along with these narratives that are being policed, that are being imposed, so that that space in which you can have that narrative freedom, that space in which you can sit with your friend or your neighbor, you can have that conversation, that we can expand that space a little bit and just be a little bit more sort of with your eyes closed, being driven along by a narrative that is being told. And at some point, hopefully these narratives can't hold anymore because there's just not enough people fully believing in them anymore. And I actually remember, Rafik, when we interviewed you for our paper, one of the very, very last things you said is that you actually had a feeling that people were becoming more resilient to these political narratives, and that you felt that that discourse and that power play around which narratives can or cannot be told was happening more and more in a political sphere and less at societal individual level. And I felt feeling a ray of hope when I heard you say that, but you know better how to interpret that. But that's a bit the direction in which I'm thinking, even though I'm very, very much aware about these very, very strong forces that are at play there, right? But at the
Absolutely.
same time, all change comes from a change in awareness. I'm convinced about that.
I could easily turn this into a conversation about the reality in which we live, which I don't want to, because the concepts that you are talking about are universal. And as I said, we can see them at play, not only in the Western Balkans, but the ferocity with which the current political elites in the region, in all countries of the region, are invested in narrative policing is enormous. It's incredible to observe. If you watch the news programs here in Prijedor or elsewhere, you will see that these issues are almost dominating the conversation here. And as soon as you step out of your ascribed role within this narrative that we are victims and they are villains and they are evil and we are good, all of a sudden the fury is directed at you, not necessarily on the other side, but at you for betraying the narrative, if you want, for stepping outside of the police zone. And this is why I believe it is so important to engage in inclusive memorialization, because for reasons, I must say, unknown to us still, we don't have sufficient research to understand where does this resilience come from. Mm-hmm. But it is there, because if it is to be judged by the ferocity of these narratives, we should have a much higher degree of violence, intergroup violence, not intragroup, but between different groups, which we don't, despite all this. So we don't really know where this resilience comes from, but it is there. And I think that the understanding, like you said, awareness of the role that collective trauma plays is crucial, because we, and this is the next question that I want to ask, because you talk in your paper about how collective trauma can lead to strong victim identities and even competitions over victimhood. This is what we live. This is our reality. And I want you to elaborate on this, and how does this dynamic influence how societies remember the past, and also when does this memory become a resource for dignity versus when does it become a constraint on social cohesion? Maybe Alison, you can take a stab at that. And also, before you answer, let me just tell everyone that you can already post your questions in chat and also raise your hand if you want. I have many other questions, but I'm aware that my 45 minutes have gone faster than I expected. So I will definitely let you ask questions, but in absence of yours, I have some. So Alison, please.
So if you don't mind, I do want to touch on the previous question just a little bit, because I just want to make the comment that simplified narratives are seductive. People get seduced by them because they do provide certainty. They do provide a strong sense of identity and oftentimes righteousness, right? And so it's not just that people are in memory prisons because of the retelling of the stories, but also because they're captured by the exquisiteness of it, right? And so I just want to mention that. And then the other thing that really came strongly to me from hearing your story is that dominant narratives have cracks in them. They have cracks, they have openings, they're not always pristine, right? Because they are so simplified and people can recognize that. And the more and more that can be recognized as a place for an opening, the more we might see arenas for action or different areas for agency. And I think if I were to give a narrative assessment of what you're talking about, Rafiq, and the resilience of people, is the recognition that more and more people are seeing that and talking about it. And that in and of itself is actually creating, an alternative narrative space for new kinds of meanings to emerge that aren't necessarily going up directly against what has become dominant, but is starting to spread in ways that actually gives more legitimacy to what you all are doing and talking about, and kind of, I don't know what the word I want to use is, kind of diffusing a little bit the strength of what's dominant. So you're actually in the process, right? Actually, what you're doing is in the process of what becomes so important, which is making sense outside of what's dominant. And that's so impressive and key and difficult and challenging. And if you make a statement, as you said, if you go completely outside, even the people around you are going to police that. And so it does get back to one of the other questions about how working in the environment is often about correcting the truth, correcting the narratives, rather than engaging in the systems. And that's really what Frauke is talking about. Like, how do you engage in the systems? Become aware of how they're operating, become aware of the limitation of your own story, because all stories are partial, all of them. And so they can be attended to. And this idea that if we correct, or that we need to just have the right information, or that if you just tell the story in the way that you're saying, that's going to somehow just be accepted, or not have any kind of resistance. The dominant narrative is actually a little bit too strong for that, because the narratives are tied to people's identities. They're tied to people's sense of belonging. They're tied to their sense of legitimacy. And so we have to really be attuned to what is, how it is that we bring in, new forms of legitimacy, how we bring in, right? So like that part about just, if I say something that's outside of it, I get backlash. We have to look at, what is the positioning happening in that moment? What is the, so anyway, so I just wanted to kind of put a narrative lens onto those moments.
In, because you mentioned this. I have to jump in with another question, and let's make this organic. And of course, you are free to come back to the question that I asked previously. But let me ask you, and then also Frauke, please add. This is what is expected mostly of transitional justice efforts, isn't it? To come up with this new, great, pristine, true narrative that will reconcile somehow all these competing and adversarial narratives that exist, especially when it comes to Truth Commission. So here's the Truth Commission. It will deliver a report which will tell us the truth about what really happened. Or in our case, it is the ICTY, it is different courts that people will often turn to and say, well, this is the truth about what happened, rather than here are the facts about these particular events. But this is the truth, this is the historical truth. That almost never works in terms of these new narratives being embraced by everyone saying, oh, yes, okay, fine. Now we can see these are the facts, so we should stop believing what we believed before and embrace these as the new narrative. That never works. I want to ask you, why does this never work? And why do you in your paper advocate for complexification and diversification of narratives rather than imposition of these new shared narratives?
So if I could say, I
Someone
want to.
else would go on about the victimization.
Okay.
All right,
We'll
I'll
come
just
back to
answer
that,
this
yeah.
quickly. I just
Yeah.
want to make one. I want to make a very clear distinction. There's a difference between strategic communications where narratives are created and deployed. That is not what we're talking about. Narrative engagement is not that. Okay, so I just want to make sure that when we're talking about understanding narrative systems and how they operate and working within these narrative systems, it's working to think about the limitations of the narratives that we have. How do we expand them to add more complexity? It's not about how do we find the one, the magic one that's going to just encapsulate everyone. Because even though, even with simplified narratives, how that becomes seductive, it has a cost. And so even when there's collective trauma, we want to simplify, but then because it's protective, but then we know that it has limitations. The shared narrative is one that seems like it's going to bring about some kind of social cohesion, but what it actually does is it simplifies the entire landscape into one story, which means that not all stories are going to be linked in. Not all ways of making sense are going to be linked in, and that is going to start leading to exclusionary, exclusions. And once again, that it can have a ripple effect where it just falls apart. So this idea that somehow we have to, have something shared is a misnomer. What we need is to be able to have a narrative landscape that's rich with things that are in tension, that aren't resolved, but that are talked about, that are able to be talked about, that don't get policed, right? That can kind of live in some kind of complexity together.
Let me ask you here, but where does genocide denial, for instance, come here into this? Can we treat it as simply an element of a rich narrative landscape, or is it like dehumanization, a delegitimized narrative that needs to be recognized?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say that, there's no way of acting that's a panacea, right? I mean, we definitely have to have our ways of being, what do you say, not selective, but using our brains, right, to be intelligent about what we're doing. And this genocide denial question, I think, is a really big one. And I guess my knee-jerk reaction is to say, like, what if we don't only focus on the extremes? Like, what if we start with where there actually is movement and complexity? And my sense is that when we do that, we take away the power of something like that without ever really, because the minute you contradict something, the minute you say, no, that's not the case, that's wrong, it strengthens it. It gives it something to react against. And it actually, that's what the research shows, that, countering and going against something reinforces it. So what if it means that our attempts, our ways of operating are not to go against, but to make other things much richer and more alive. So it kind of silences or not silences, because then we'd be doing the same thing, but kind of
Find the
softens
cracks, like
the
you
impact.
were saying before, finding the cracks in the denial in a way complexify it without reinforcing it by simply making it, legitimizing it as a kind of yet another story. So we have our story,
Yeah.
they have their story. But this complexification, this is a notion that I think is key here. And we are, I think, to me, this feels very much like exploratory work in terms of how to get to very clear understandings of what to do. But Frauke, please go ahead before, and also I will again invite the people who are following our conversation to raise their hand if they have questions, or post their questions in the chat uh, uh, before I ask more questions.
Yeah, thank you. So I think victimhood is a really important topic, and particularly sort of competition for victimhood, because I think, but you know much better than I do, but I think it's something that plays out in the Western Balkans quite significantly. So in a way, it's very logical that victimhood is something that often becomes a central feature of a group's identity after, you know, mass violence or suppression. It's a reaction to, you know, deeply felt and shared experience, and it brings forth a strong desire for security and understanding within the group with people who have undergone the same experience. So this one's own hurt then tends to lead to, you know, withdrawal into one's own group, and this victimhood then becomes often an essential tenet of that. So, but what actually then can happen over time is, you know, when one feels deeply hurt, restoring or damaged, restoring a sense of dignity becomes crucial for one's healing, both as an individual and as a group. And being acknowledged for that harm done and having a recognition of that harm done is extremely important. It's just very, very strong, again, a very, very strong psychological need. And the less that is forthcoming, the deeper that victim identity becomes grieving, becomes hurtful, becomes a strong part of one's memory, of one's identity. And what can then happen is that it actually reduces the empathy for other victim groups. It's almost as if other groups have also suffered, as if that somehow undermines the severity of one's own suffering, that one almost wants to establish the sort of primacy of one's own suffering versus other people's suffering. And that it's sometimes called the egoism of victimization, actually. And that can then lead to sort of putting harm on a scale and putting victimhood on a scale, and leading to this competition for victimhood. And that's actually really quite a destructive and dangerous force, because it really disallows particular different victim groups who have all suffered equally to sort of come together, share experiences, and perhaps take action together or re-find agency together. And it further fragments in a way, and it can lead to this real identity politics. I think we're seeing more and more of that in the world now. You know, you have not gone through my lived experience, so you're not part of my group. You're not part of my suffering because you don't have the same lived experience. And I think it's this whole discourse around intersectionality. It's really, really important, but it can also really lead to further fragmentation of hurt identities, if you like, and it leads to a fragmentation of stories, of identities. It becomes more and more difficult to cross over these identity boundaries. And the discourse is really, as long your story is not my story, so therefore your story is a threat to my story, and it's therefore a threat to my identity. And that's what we're really hoping, in a way, to move away from, that we're coming closer to saying, my story is not your story, but our stories may be equally legitimate. And this victimhood, this competition for victimhood, and the egoism of victimization really stands in the way of that. And I don't know, Mira, I think you'll know much better, but I think in memorialization, this is incredibly important, because there is this strong psychological need for memorials, for being seen for how one is a victim. It's super, super important. But at the same time, if it's too narrow, too closely linked to very rigid identities, group boundaries, it may actually feed into this dynamic. I'm sure you're aware of that. Even the title, Inclusive Memorialisation, shows me that you're very much aware of that. But I think the psychological dynamic underpinning that is key, is crucial.
Can I just give one
Go
very
ahead.
different, so just to add on to that rich example, I worked, did a lot of research in Colombia, and you don't even have to do a lot of research in Colombia to know this example, but one of the things that they did after the civil conflict, however you characterize it, was that they created a victims law. And that victims law kind of directed how funds were going to be distributed, how people were going to have reparations in the aftermath of the violence. And so I just want to pose a way in which victimhood gets appropriated on to people. Because then in the communities that were affected by violence, they had to produce themselves as victims. And they had to produce themselves as a particular kind of victim in a particular kind of way. And so the kind of the competition for victimhood became so instantiated because of the ways in which the institutional practices defined victimhood. And so it can happen by a self-definition, but it can also happen by a definition that gets put on that you then need to live into. And we see that in many different kinds of contexts where you need to produce yourself, produce your story in very particular ways in order to be acknowledged, in order to be, in order to receive any kind of legitimacy, even funds, even roads in your community. And that when you have victims who can easily produce in terms of how the institution reads, with documents and things, then you have communities who can't produce in that particular kind of way. So there's kinds of competitions, and it's not necessarily like adversarial, but there's emotional weight to those relationships then, and they get and we don't, and what kinds of support do we have and they don't. And so victimhood can be instantiated in that way too, in a kind of oversimplified way.
That I think warrants a conversation unto itself, because every example of this kind of victim definition, if you want, impacting people's understanding of their own victimhood we have here, especially when it comes to different ethnic governments, if you want, and how they see only people from their own group as victims, while the others who live in the same territory are directed to seek their benefit somewhere else, and so on. Let me see what Victoria says. Thank you for the very interesting presentations, which provided a lot to reflect upon. However, discussing victimhood makes me wonder whether the terminology used contributes to victimization. Changing terminology for certain groups has helped to some extent in Bosnia, as the term survivor has a somewhat empowering element in itself. It changed how they look at them and others. Thank you, Victoria. I don't know if you have a comment on this, or because it's not a question, rather a comment.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking about this in class yesterday, and this is exactly where it went to be honest. It was, when we're able to provide spaces where people can actually tell the stories that they would want to tell about themselves rather than, responding to the stories that are told about them, they recast themselves in different kinds of ways. And I really think the survivor language is something that has, really proliferated. I mean, it's come, in the US in domestic violence cases. And I'm sure we could name many different contexts. And so, yes, I do believe that part of that is how do we break free from the ways that these categories have been consolidated over however many years of the ways in which conflict gets storied around the world, and how different kinds of people who come out of war get positioned. And so that's the survivor language has become a kind of a resistance, right, an alternative storyline that has created way more agency for people. And so I think the fact that you made that connection, it's just, yes, I'm also there making that connection with you, and I'm curious about how that develops over time, and how to start infusing different kinds of ways of making sense of people's experiences that can incorporate more agentic language.
Let me ask you, because
Can I come in on this one, Rafik?
sure, absolutely. But let me just give you another question so that you can kind of deal with this as well, because it has to do with what was just said. And that is going towards solutions that you are talking about in your paper. And I think this is also part of perhaps that discussion. You talk about narrative self-reflection. You talk about this as one of the key strategies that you are advocating to encourage narrative self-reflection. And I want to ask you, you touched upon it here, how does that look in practice, and how can becoming aware of your own narrative help reduce bias, for instance, especially in deeply polarized or traumatized societies like ours?
Yeah, and thank you, Rafik. Because before you also asked me, when you asked about the victimhood, you also asked like when it can it become a resource for dignity, and when does it do the opposite. I think this is important because we've been speaking a lot about these post-traumatic narratives, if you like, as being simplified, us versus them, black and white, and all of that. But there's also other narratives that emerge. So it's not always negative, actually. And what we see is there are more what we call resilience-inducing or resilience-enhancing narratives. And so some communities do come out of traumatic experiences in a more, I don't know, can we call it constructive or positive way? And what we really see is that these stories, that these narratives, they focus on survival. They focus on resilience. They focus on, look what made us get through this experience. It's our connectedness. It's our cultural identity. It's the agency that we had. And that's actually what makes both individuals and societies come up with a much more healthy or healing type of stories. And I don't think we understand fully and entirely what would make some groups come out more in that way, more on the other. I would have some speculative reasons that I could come up with, but there are these kinds of narratives that get created as well. And I think this links into your other questions, because what could self-reflection possibly do? So what we would hope to get out of there is a stronger awareness of how these, well, first of all, to the strong extent to which we're actually influenced by them. It shapes our thinking, it shapes the way we look at ourselves, we look at others, we look at the world. So being a bit aware of that memory prison, if you like, the way that we're captured and seduced, by these narratives. I think that is the first level of reaching more awareness about that. And then hopefully with that comes a stronger recognition of how simplified these narratives are. So what they leave out, really. And how they're very rigid and create very, very rigid boundaries between, you know, perpetrators and victims. So as soon as these boundaries become a bit more fluid, and some of these more resilience enhancing narratives, they have more fluid boundaries. They can see that amongst the group that was, you know, the perpetrators, if you like, there were allies, there were people that were actually helping out, that this one single story did not always hold through. There were other experiences, there were particular situations, maybe more at micro level, in which that one narrative did not actually pan out that way. And in that way, more nuance can get created. And that's what really this complexifying of the narrative is. So one starts with adding more nuance, by complexifying, by including more elements, by including more nuance into one's own perspective, one's own narrative. And that actually, and we said it before, that actually creates more agency and more sort of action options, different ways that it opens. When you should change your sort of diagnosis of a problem, the way you analyze a problem, when you change that, then you also change what you see as possible ways forward. You expand when you expand your diagnostic options, you expand your action options. And hopefully with that comes also a bit of a sense of agency, like we said, but perhaps also a stronger sense of responsibility. And that's a very difficult step to take, but to see how oneself behaves because of that narrative, because of how we're influenced, how we behave, how we may actually be contributing to the problem, how we may be contributing to that polarization, to that us and them dynamic. And that kind of awareness, of increased consciousness, that's what we're really hoping to achieve through self-reflection. And
let me, this is the perfect moment for me to kind of throw these final 3 questions at you so that you can both kind of wrap it up. First of all, I would like to ask very specifically what, in your view, what role can memorialization spaces like museums, commemorations, exhibitions play in fostering this kind of reflection? Second, in your paper, you speak about the importance of amplifying silenced or marginalized stories. This is precisely what our project and what our work is about. And I want to ask you, how do you think practitioners can do this without triggering backlash or reinforcing divisions, which sometimes we can see also play out? And also, as the last question, because we have quite a few people engaged through this project, but not only through this project, and more broadly in this kind of work through media, art, and this kind of space in working on shaping or trying to complexify narratives, and what do you believe are some principles for designing such interventions that can contribute to this self-reflection and diversity? So you can speak
so
about everything.
I want to add one thing about the narrative self-reflection. So part of what we're reflecting on is the notion that sometimes we don't realize the stories that we're caught up in. right? We're just telling stories. We don't realize that we're actually caught up in them, and that oftentimes they are inflected by dominant stories that have existed in our society for however long, that have been instantiated through whatever it is, our movies, our laws, our media. And so first, recognizing that that dynamic is happening is part of the narrative self-reflection. And there are ways in which it's Hilda Nelson who talks about how when we have when we're in traumatic situations and our identities are traumatized, sometimes we have what she calls an infiltrated consciousness, which means that we take on stories about ourselves that aren't necessarily true. And so I'm just thinking about like when people experience, violence, and like the shame that comes up, or the feelings of inadequacy, or whatever it is. And those are also stories that need to be reflected on in terms of how they're in relationship to the conflict, how they're in relationship to this idea of healing a society, because that is a real part of it. What do memorials and commemorations offer this? Not necessarily that particular situation, but those spaces have, they can do multiple things. They could reinforce one single dominant narrative, which would have, a detrimental impact on a flourishing society. But they can also be sites for engagement that are alive and living, and that, they can be designed for reflection. They can hold multiple experiences side by side. I would want to hear so much more about the kinds of things that you all have done already, because for me, speaking about this in generalized terms when I'm not a memorialization and commemoration specialist, feels a little bit out of turn. But if there's a way to have these spaces invite people to grapple and not just take in one story, then that is a way that they can be constructive spaces, not spaces where we're trying to find agreement, not spaces where we have to. But I think you understand what I'm saying, so I'll let Frauke. I know you asked like 5 questions, but I don't want to.
I also asked about what are some of the principles that you would say should guide this attempt at diversification and self-reflection when it comes to, for instance, interventions in memorials, but also in art and in storytelling, because I think that like we touched upon it very briefly when we talked about genocide denial, just kind of counteracting and trying to somehow defeat this other narrative gives it power, and we can observe that happening here as well. These kind of principles of diversification of narratives, I would say, are also interesting thing to talk about. But I understand we more and more I think about this conversation. For instance, I think that in any future iteration of a similar project, I would actually insist on including like a full day or 2 days of work with you guys and other people to address this, because I still feel, even though we spoke almost for an hour and a half, that we are scratching the surface on so many things. Because, for instance, for each of these theoretical or universal concepts that we have discussed, there are so many, there are floods of examples that I would like to introduce in the conversation here so that we can take them apart for what they are, but there is simply no space. Sorry. So maybe Frauke, and then Alison, you can come back for your final word as well.
Sure. Yeah, I also feel a little out of my depth in really giving out principles for inclusive memorialization. But I think just from our perspective and from the concepts that we are kind of introducing here, I think there's 3 broad ways that I'm thinking about it. And the first one is really that self-reflection on narrative. So here, indeed, I think Alison put it really great, spaces where people can grapple with that, which can actually be a bit of a platform or an arena in which that self-reflection can take place. I think that is a very important one. So seeing the sort of linearity of one's own narrative, but perhaps also seeing the cracks in some of these dominant narratives. So I think that's one dimension of it. The second dimension I see is that these spaces, they really create an arena in which there's this plurality, this diversity of different stories can be portrayed. So there's really let the thousand flowers bloom kind of logic. So trying to get away from this, it's either this story or that story, or this story is a threat to that story. Come closer to individual stories, because not a single individual story actually matches the narrative, even of one's own social group, right? Because that is simplified. So bring out more diversity in these stories. And we sometimes speak about this sort of eco-narrative ecosystem, to not have these one or two major trees, but have a lot of bushes and different flowers, and create this biodiversity in the narrative landscape. So I think that's another important role. So try and stay away from this countering narratives, try and replace one with another, but go more towards, plurality. And then in terms of, bringing out more marginalized stories, I can see that there could be a strong pushback against that, but I think the more you think in plurality, perhaps that pushback, I don't know, maybe a little less. But I think what's also important is to really shed the light on those narratives that are out there already, that are more inclusive in nature, that are more based on resilience, that are more focused on connectedness. The ones that don't emphasize, look at us being glorious, but look at us being strong internally and being connected to each other. Look at us as a source of humanity and how we've used that. These kinds of stories, the more you shed the light on those, and those that, as I said before, also have more fluid boundaries, have more zones of gray, that are not black and white. The more you can bring those forward, then perhaps a little less threatening than those ones that really go completely countering the dominant narrative. And I think maybe one other thing is that I think there's also something, and this maybe comes back to your question about denying the Holocaust. I mean, that's obviously an extreme, but I think there are, because of the fact that all these stories exist in the same space, every story, every narrative comes with particular words that are very triggering for other groups. So I think a heightened awareness of what words are particularly painful, particularly triggering for other groups. I think it would be good to sort of surface those, and being a little careful about those. Not by, again, restricting and silencing, but I think a degree of sensitivity around that is important. And maybe one last thing that I could add, because I still think this competition for victimhood is very important. So the degree to which stories could come out or presented in a way that they cross over identity boundaries and sort of lead to more inclusive sense of empathy, and for the sort of never again, not to apply only to one's own group, but to apply to the world at large. Again, not as a counter narrative, but as perhaps something to be aware about, which stories are perhaps receiving a bit more water, if you like, in your ecosystem garden. I hope that's helpful.
Or air. Thank you. And Alison, your last.
So I'll just be brief. So thinking about, because I think ultimately we're talking about, you know, in thinking about collective trauma, a lot of what we've been talking about is narrative change or narrative transformation or narrative evolution. And just to say that for evolution or transformation to happen, we don't need to overhaul all the stories, right? Creating complexity can have some minor moves in it that have, you know, very tremendous impacts. And so I don't want it to sound like these big overhauling things have to happen. And yet it's a complicated process. It is not easy. It asks a lot of people. It asks a lot of people to really, especially in really conflict, traumatized societies, to really think about the way they're thinking about things. So while shifts don't have to be cataclysmic, the process has to be very cared for and very, you know, very well facilitated. And that it's not, I just want to make it clear that the introduction of stories and telling stories does not create narrative transformation. Because if you hear 100 stories and your story stays intact and everybody else's story stays intact, transformation has not happened. You haven't done work. Now that I think is different when you're in spaces where people are able to tell their story for the first time, where they've been policed into silence. I think that's a different experience. So we have different contexts where we need to think about what is it that, you know, that we're looking for, or that that we're aiming for people to experience. But I just wanted to make a couple of those points before we have to say goodbye.
Well, on that note, I think we did justice to discussing the concepts that you brought up in the paper in terms of mentioning most of them, not really going full in depth because the time does not allow for this. But I sense that this is not the last conversation. It is the first, but not the last conversation on this topic in this context, because I believe this is one of the most important conversations to have. We need to understand how collective trauma is shaping our narratives, how it's shaping our understanding of our experience, but also most importantly of how those in power are able to use it to either achieve certain goals or keep us in these memory prisons. And at the end, I have to say thank you to everyone who was listening. And most of all, thank you, Frauke, and thank you, Alison, for being guests in this webinar. And I very much look forward to seeing you soon in real life, in person. Thank you. And this is the end of this second in the series of webinars that are part of different memories, shared futures towards inclusive memorialization in the Western Balkan series. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having us, Rafik.